Bon, c'est une grande joie pour moi d'être ici parmi vous ce matin, de louer le Seigneur, comme c'était magnifique la musique. En tout cas, il y a beaucoup de gens ici en Amérique et même en Afrique qui me demandaient la même chose. Ils me demandaient pourquoi tu es là, parce que c'est un peu bizarre, quoi. Et toujours, j'ai dit la même chose. J'ai dit, car Dieu a tellement aimé le monde, il a donné son Fils unique, afin que tous les hommes qui croient en lui ne meurent pas, mais qu'il ait la vie éternelle. Amen. 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 Let me tell you what I said, if I can remember, so he doesn't throw me out and said, you should go to the church up the street. I'm going to try to interpret if I can remember what I said. I said, what a wonderful joy it is for me to be here this morning to worship the Lord together with this wonderful music. And I said there were a lot of people in Africa and in America who always ask me the same question. Why would you go to Africa? The Africans didn't understand. I didn't say all this, but they didn't understand why we would leave this to go there. And Americans don't understand why you would leave this to go there. And I always, toujours, said the same thing. Car Dieu a tellement aimé le monde, because God so loved this world. And I like it in French better. It says, son fils unique, his unique son, that we might have life and life everlasting. Aren't you glad? Well, I'm going to try not to be boring. If I get boring, raise your hand and I'll do a teeth trick or something. And I found out some folks knew one of the boys that we had in our dorm in Africa, Pete. I love Pete. I wish he was here. I would sit down and let Pete talk. But anyway, I'm going to talk to you this morning, and I will try. He told me to go as long as I want, but you folks leave at 1:15, so I'm just kidding. He did not say that. I will try to be as brief as possible. I'm not always known to be super brief. One of my pet peeves, though, is to have somebody talk and you not know anything about them. And so let me just give you a little bit of introduction. I'm not very special, if that's the word. I grew up in Slocum Station, Ohio. We had 300 people, if you count dogs, cats, and rake handles. It was just this little place. I grew up in a little house. The house I grew up in was probably less than 500 square feet. You put the key in the front door and knock out the back window. I mean, the mice were humpback in our house. I mean, it was little. We had to go outside just to change our mind. The house was little, but I can tell you the home was huge. And I will tell you, if I had it to do over again, I would grow up in a little house. Because here's what happened. When grandkids came, if they did a somersault, everybody noticed because they hit you. In a big house, nobody notices. And it's the noticing that makes a house a home, doesn't it? So I'm glad that my dad worked in a steel mill for 35 or 45 years, swing shift. Mom stayed at home. They were married for 71 years. Somebody asked me, they said, how'd they do that? I go, they didn't die. I mean, that's what happens, right? Most people would stay married a long time, but somebody ups and dies. After I got out of high school, I went away to the Ohio State University, which is the reigning national football champion. I am a huge Buckeye fan, I'm sorry, but and we got Virginia Tech the first weekend of this year. You may not be Virginia Tech fans. If you're not, good. But I graduated from there a long time ago. Answered the call to go to the mission field, went to, at the time, Free Will Baptist Bible College, met this young lady who I thought was the most beautiful girl ever. And now after 38 years, she's prettier now than she was when we got married. And I don't mean that facetiously. She is a wonderful lady. I may talk about her in a little bit. She would die if she knew I was talking about her. But she was, some of you may remember James Earl Raper, that was at the children's home. It was his youngest daughter. So we got married, went to France to go to language school after being house parents at the children's home. Spent a year learning to speak French. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life because you think you're an idiot. You think you can say, you think you're intelligent, but you can't say, look at Puff, funny, funny Puff. It is, some of you remember that from Dick and Jane. Do you remember Dick and Jane? How many of you read Dick and Jane? Thank you. You just told your age. Went to Ivory Coast, and there we served at the boarding school for missionaries' children. We were there for 7 years, I think. But it left an indelible mark on me. Those boys left an indelible mark that I will never get over. I'm so proud of him. I'm proud of Pete, what he's doing. Just an incredible young man. I've got guys all over the world. I just was talking to one of my boys. I go, where are you? He goes, I'm not real sure. He's a surgeon for Samaritan's Purse, and he's somewhere in the Congo. He said, they just flew me in here, and I'm doing surgeries. But now he's officially stationed there. But anyway, it's just been a wonderful life. Because of my wife's health problems with malaria, she just didn't hold up well in the tropics, and so we had to come home. Which was just the hardest thing I've ever done besides language school. And then I worked for Free Will Baptist Bible College, or Welch College, for a while as the director of recruitment. I was terrible at my job. Not in one sense, but I couldn't do my job because all the students would come in and talk to me about their problems because they knew I wouldn't tell anybody. And so they would talk to me, and I finally told my wife, if I'm going to do this, I probably should get trained. So I went back to graduate school and finished a doctorate in counseling psychology. And just as I was graduating from my doctoral program, James Forline, who was the director of international missions, he said, we want somebody to be our director of member care, which means we need somebody to take care of our missionaries. He said, we want somebody with professional counseling training and who has had overseas experience. And in Free Will Baptist, that meant me. So I became the director of member care, and I'm still there part-time because of the financial situation of the mission. I can't be full-time, so I work 6 other jobs to try to make up for that. I'm serious. That's what I do. I teach adjunctly a couple places and do a variety of things. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. My wife and I have been married for 38 years, have a daughter and a grandson. If you'd like to know about Jagger, I'll be happy to tell you and show you pictures. He is such a wonderful. How many of you have grandkids? Aren't they the greatest? I told my daughter, I don't know what happened to you. He's better than you ever were. She said, well, thank you, Dad. I go, I'm sorry. Because I can send him home. Well, what I want to talk to you this morning about, I want to talk to you, I actually switched. I was going to talk about missions, but the truth is everything we talk about is missions. Everything. This book, I have an electronic version, but this book is about missions. It's the story of God's glory to the nations. Read the book. Every passage. And by the way, I always hear this, well, I've just never been called to missions. Listen to me. He said this, go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel. If you're waiting to be called, you just got it. He said, go. He did not say, sit ye there and wait ye there for them to come unto thee so you can preach unto them. By the way, that's the way we've done church for a long time, right? We expect people to come in here. Now, some of you may not like this, and if you don't agree with me, that's okay. I'll pray for you. I'm glad when people come to church and get saved, aren't you? I just don't know if that's the biblical model. He said, go. We come in church and expect them to come here. I'm glad. But read the New Testament. You never seek. The only time it mentions unbelievers, it said for us not to act like a bunch of crazies. That's in the NIV, Neil's Incredible Version. It said do things orderly so they won't think you're nuts. He said, go. You're having this mission. It means you walk out those doors and take Jesus with you. Sometimes we just have Jesus when we come here. We're all good Christians today, aren't I'm telling you, I'm a great Christian today. Monday's coming. How many of you work secular jobs? Okay, see your hand. I envy you. that work in the, I envy you. You get to be salt and light. I work with Christians all the time. It's hard to be salt and light if you stay in the salt shaker. I envy you. You get to be Jesus at your work. How cool is that? I'm sorry. That's not what I was going to talk about. That was free. Here, I want to talk about a noun clause that changed my life. I know what you're thinking. I don't even know what a noun clause is. Me either. But I did look it up. If they would tell me that I could only have one book in the Bible, if they told you you were stranded on a desert island, and you could only take one book out of the Bible, which one would you take? That was not a rhetorical question. What would you take? John? Or Daniel? What would you take? Ephesians. I like to fish too. Romans, if you're a theologian, you want to take Romans. What would you take? Romans? Not me. I would take a little book. It's one of the smaller books. It's a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Philippi. We call it Philippians. I love Philippians. Part of the reason, 16 times in the book of Philippians, it talks about joy. It's a happy book. I like happy. I said this at the seniors retreat. If you're depressed, don't read Ecclesiastes. I think Eeyore wrote Ecclesiastes. Vanity, always vanity. Do you remember? And Tigger tried to help me. Oh, but there's a time to live, but there's a time to die. Eeyore wrote the book. I want joy, and so I love Philippians. Philippians, if you remember, I think it's Acts chapter 16, 17, where it talks about the story of Paul planting the church in Philippi. Remember, one of the reasons I like is that's the first place in Europe that the gospel was ever preached. And from Philippi, it went on up into Rome. Nero tried to destroy it. Don't you remember? He would burn Christians at the stake to light the city. When the city of Rome burned down, Nero blamed the Christians for it when he's the one who did. He tried to snuff out the flame of the gospel. He couldn't. By the way, the gospel then went through the dark ages when the flame of the gospel was just a flicker. And then some guy up in Wittenberg, Germany, tacked these things. 95 or 98 pieces on this church door in Wittenberg and started a Protestant Reformation. That came through Switzerland on down through France with the Huguenots, and some of them went over into England. They were being persecuted. They burned people at the stake for translating the scripture into English. We take it for granted, right? Some of those folks said, we don't want this persecution anymore. Let's go to the new country. Some of those came east. Some of them came down the Ohio River, up the little Scioto River, up this little creek called Ward's Run. And there they planted a church. And this little 11-year-old boy named Neil heard the gospel. And I got saved. And it was because Paul went to Philippi. That's where it started. Aren't you glad? I'm glad he went to Philippi because but there was a group of ladies there that were having a Bible study along the river, and Paul went in and started talking about Jesus, and they, being good Free Will Baptists, they took him to the house for supper. Read it. They went and ate, and that was the nucleus of that little church. And it was a church that Paul absolutely loved. And so he's sitting in prison, and he's writing this letter to this little group of believers in the city of Philippi. And he is telling them just how much he loved them. He said, when I think about you, I get filled with joy. I just think, I'm sure when your pastor's away and when he thinks about you, his heart's filled with joy, at least 87% of you. He is filled with joy. Because by the health of a church by how well they laugh. I've been to church. I'm tired of going to church with dead folks. They're going, yeah, that's good. I'm glad. Anyway, there were some people that were being very critical of Paul, and that were starting to teach some doctrine that was not true. And Paul says this in the beginning of chapter 3. He said, you watch those dogs. I heard a black minister preach a whole sermon on watch those dogs. It was an awesome sermon. He talked about all the dogs in church. You know, said, you got the coon hounds. They've been up howling all night to come dragging in and sleep halfway through the service. And he said, you got those poodle dogs. Said, they just come in about 10 minutes late and prance right down the middle aisle so everybody will see. He said, you have them little yapping dogs. He said, they just yap. Anyway, it's a great sermon. And Paul then says, after he talks about it, then he says, you know, here's the reality. If somebody could boast about their faith, I'm the guy. Now, it seemed a little arrogant to me. But then he lists in chapter 3 8 different things of what made him a great Jew. He said, you know, I was born in the tribe of Benjamin, the honored tribe, if you will. He was a Pharisee. He was a persecutor. He was circumcised on the end. He went through 8 things. And he said, when I look at all of that, I had a little ribbon. He was Mr. Jew. You'll get that after a while. About lunchtime, you'll go, oh, Mr. Jew. Anyway. He said, all that I consider as rubbish. Some translations say as dung. My understanding in the Greek, it's even a stronger term that I won't use. In Africa, we would say it's yama yama. I love that word. When we took our trash out in Africa, there were usually a dozen people waiting for it. Because you can burn paper. You can drink out of a can. You can cook in a can. When they were done with it, what was left was yama yama. It was not worth anything. Paul said that in comparison to all that, me knowing Jesus, all the rest of that was nothing. I am way overeducated. I am educated far beyond my intelligence. I just went to school a long time. It takes some of us longer than others. I spent 4 of the best years of my life in the 3rd grade. I'm just kidding. They would have passed me, but they didn't want me to be with Dad. Thank you, Jeff Foxworthy. Then it came to verse 10. And verse 10 changed my life. I'm serious. I was at the children's home. Pastor Rob Morgan, who is still my pastor, brought a guy in, and he spent the whole weekend talking about this. And this verse, in a good sense, has haunted me the rest of my life. And the verse is a noun clause. It's right in the middle of a sentence. And here's what it says: that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable to his death. He said that I may know him. Here's my question for you. Do you know God? I didn't ask if you were a Christian. I didn't ask if you were saved. I ask, do you know God? Now, one of my other pet peeves is we use a lot of terms that nobody knows. We use a lot of churchy terms, right? Now, we know what they mean, but so what does it mean to know God? In the Amplified Version, it says something like this. Listen to this. To know God means to progressively become more deeply and intimately acquainted with him, recognizing and perceiving the wonders of his person more fully and clearly every day. Can I say that again? I wish I could. No, I can't. Sorry, lost my mind for a second. To know him means to progressively, it doesn't happen all at once. I read a lot of children's books because I understand them. My favorite children's book of all time is The Velveteen Rabbit. Anybody read The Velveteen Rabbit? If you've never read The Velveteen Rabbit, go buy a copy. It's a marvelous book. Marjorie Williams, I think, is the author. But in my book on page 28 and a little over on page 29, there's this passage that goes something like this. It said, "What is real?" said the rabbit to the skin horse as they sat side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came in to tidy up the room. "Does it mean you have a stick-out handle or things that buzz inside you?" "Real's not how you're made," said the skin horse. "It's something that happens to you after a child has played with you for a very long time." "Does it hurt?" said the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse. "That's why it doesn't happen to toys who have to be held carefully or have sharp edges." "Does it happen all at once?" asked the rabbit. "No," said the skin horse. "It happens," listen to this, "it happens bit by bit. Coming to know God happens progressively. It happens bit by bit." My question is, do you know him more today than you did yesterday? I would tell you, I do a lot of premarital counseling. I love to do premarital. I wish I could have a whole career. All I did was premarital counseling because that's happy counseling. You know what I'm saying? They're in love. They look like two cows dying in a hailstorm. You know, you've been there. Right? And I always say to them, you think you know each other, right? Anybody remember that when you got married? You thought you knew everything about them. Wrong. You get to that point, you look over and you go, what in the world? Where did he come from? That's not the guy who said I do. You see, I hope I know my wife better after 38 years than I did the night we were married. I hope you do too, don't you? I do a lot of couples retreats too, and one of the things I always say is, always be a student of your spouse. We change. Always be a student. I want to be a student of Jesus. I want to get to know him more intimately. So it happens progressively. To know him means progressively and more intimately. I want to be intimate with Jesus. As my Irish friends would say, I want to feel his bonny breath upon me. That I may know him, to progressively become more deeply and intimately acquainted with him, recognizing, perceiving the wonders of his person more fully and clearly. We had an African missionary in Africa. She was from Yazoo City, Mississippi, where Jerry Clower was from, but she was funnier than Jerry Clower, but just didn't mean to be. She'd always say, that Lord, he's a mess, ain't he? I go, we're not allowed to say that. But she was right. When you understand the wonders of his person, you fall incredibly in love with Jesus. Are you in love with Jesus? Yeah? I'm glad you said yes. Can I ask a question? What's that mean? If I were to ask you, what does it mean to love somebody? I bet I would get 36 different answers. I made that number up right then. Right? Because we all have this idea of what it means to love somebody. Let me give you, actually, this comes from my world of psychology, Sullivan's triangular theory of love. It's so beautiful. It says this, to love somebody is, first of all, there's passion. Now, that's been too long ago for some of you to remember. I wish you could have heard Greg when he would call Teresa when they were dating. It would have made you throw up. He would call her, and they would talk for hours about nothing. And then he would say, you hang up first. And she would say, no, you. And there would be this long silence. Then he'd say, I still hear you breathing. You remember? Just did that last week. Y'all pray for them. They didn't have to hurt way too much. It's passion, right? By the way, in a marriage, I don't think that should ever leave. I don't care how old you are. When my dad and mom were married for 71 years, they're in their 90s. He'd look across at the room. They were disgusting. He'd be kissing on her. I go, Dad, don't be kissing on her. You just mind your own business. I love that. It's passion. When you love somebody, it's passion. It's also intimacy. I just want to be with them. Can I tell you, I can't wait to get home this afternoon. I get to be in the house with my wife. We may not have to talk. I just want to be there. I want to be with her. I went to visit my grandson before I came up here because my schedule, I won't be at my church until the second or third week of August. I've got a busy summer schedule. And I wanted to see him. You know why? I just wanted that intimacy. So does Jesus. When you love somebody, you want that, right? And they're the third component of that. By the way, if you just have passion and intimacy, you know what you call that? Romance. That's what all the novels are written about. The third part of that, of loving somebody, is commitment. When I do premarital counseling, I say, I use that passage in Genesis 2:24, which is a funny verse. I don't know if you find some verses funny. This is a funny verse. It says, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, shall cling to his wife. The two shall become one flesh, right? You don't think that's funny? It's in Genesis 2. He's talking to Adam and Eve. He said, you shall leave your mother and father. Who are they supposed to leave? Hello? Greg will tell you how that works later. But when he says you shall cling to your, in the Hebrew, that word has this connotation of permanence. I tell my premarital, that means, sir, that she's yours till you're plumb dead. When you say I do, you mean it. And I will, you mean it. That's what love is. That's what Jesus, that's how he wants us to love him. He wants us to be passionate about him. He wants us to have this intimate relationship with him. He wants us to be committed. Here's the better news. That's exactly how he loves us. He's passionate about you. If God had a billfold, he'd pull it out and show everybody your picture. He longs. I think maybe I have a more vivid imagination, but I always picture God sitting on his throne waiting for me to come every morning. I'm sure he goes, tells the angel, Neil's coming, this will be good, come on. He longs for that intimacy with us. He wants that intimacy with us. I was talking about this at a school in Africa. I went back out a few years ago, and one of the house moms said, all morning I was so busy, but I kept going, God, I promise I'm coming. She said, I just saw him sitting there waiting for me. She said, I know I'm coming. And by the way, he said he would be with us. As my African friends would say, Shuska, until the 12th of never. And that's the long, long time to quote Donny Osmond, which only a fool would. But it's forever, right? I want to know him that way, don't you? But how do you do that? Well, the verse tells us, he said, I may know him, the power of his resurrection. Okay, let me ask you. Oh, gosh. Let me ask you a question. This is not rhetorical. I love preaching in Africa because if you have a question, they'll answer it. They will talk back to you. Pretend you're African. So somebody tell me what the resurrection was all about. Why was the resurrection important? Or what did you say? Why was the resurrection important? You've been in church most of your life, right? Most of you. You should know this. Excuse me, puberty struck again. Most of you know this. Don't start snorting over there. What was the resurrection all about? Anybody know? Huh? It makes it for real. Makes what for real? Life. everlasting. For us. You see, here's the deal. Satan's ultimate weapon is death. Right? The scripture says the wages of sin are what? Or is what? Death. That's Satan's ultimate weapon. Jesus defeated that. Now that's pretty powerful, right? When I was growing up in the closest little town, which was not as big as Wise, so it was, anyway, every year in August, they would bring this tent revival in, and on Friday, they would always raise this lady up from the dead. It was always really great. I'm serious. She would jump out of the casket in a white robe and go running around the tent and had fire guns. Well, that'd be cool if it really happened. By the way, I'm not going to talk about this, but God's still raising people from the dead. Now, if you have trouble believing that, don't. But anyway, that's a powerful thing. Because he defeated sin. What that means for me is this. I have, listen to this, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead to overcome any sin that plagues me. I just have to grab a hold of the power of the resurrection that's available to me. Don't tell me you can't quit. Because if you're a follower of Christ, you have access to the same power of the resurrection that raised Jesus from the dead to defeat any sin that you have to deal with. You have that. Here's the problem. We're too trifling. Is that a word? Aren't we? Because we enjoy it. Or whatever. Or you say, well, that's just me. Well, maybe you just need to get over just you. If you don't live by the fruit of the Spirit, if you don't display the fruit of the Spirit every day, you need to get over yourself, because I think it's sin. And you have the power to defeat that. How cool is that? He said, I may know him, the power of his resurrection, the fellowship, oh, I don't like this one, the fellowship of his suffering. How many of you have suffered lately for the cause of Christ? Yeah, absolutely. I don't suffer a lot. Not for Jesus' sake. I'll be honest. When I read that, I'm going, wow, for me to know God, somehow I'm going to have to fellowship in Christ's suffering. What does that mean for me? Because, I've been made fun of. I almost got voted off the island in my doctoral program because of my faith. Because I believe certain lifestyles are sinful. I just believe that because I think that's what the book says. I happen to believe the book. Don't you? Oh, can I tell a wee story? Can I see your Bible a minute? Do you have a Bible, a regular Bible? Can I see your Bible a minute? We all carry electronic. Thank you so much for your ministry. You all appreciate this book? Do you like this book? Huh? I'm not sure. You like that book? We love that book. I am. I love you. I love it. Let me tell you about Clive Carver. I don't know if that name's familiar. He used to be the head of World Relief, one of the largest Christian humanitarian organizations in the world. Clive Carver had flown to southern Sudan, which was one of the most desolate places in the world. Darfur, if some of you are familiar with that from the news. And he was going to tell them that he was bringing grain for them to plant and grain for them to make bread and to eat. And they put him in a little airplane and was flying him from village to village. And he got out in this village and walked all over the village and said, he came back to the plane. He said, you got to take me away. I cannot. I was watching babies die in their mom's arms as I was walking through that village of starvation. I can't take me to another. He said, I just can't take this anymore. He got out, they flew him to the next village. He got out and he walked through the village, couldn't find anybody. It was empty. Finally, he got way to the edge of the village, and it was like the whole village was gathered around this baobab tree. You know about, those are the trees that look like they're upside down and the roots are sticking out. You've probably seen them in National Geographic, the great big trunks. They were all under the baobab tree, and he got to the edge, and through his translator, he asked this lady, he says, what are you doing? She said, we're worshiping Jesus. Do you know him? And he goes, well, yeah. I said, and I've come here, we're bringing you grain so you can eat and so you can plant it. She goes, we've heard that there's a book. Have you ever seen the book? He said, I didn't want to tell her I probably have 30 copies at my house. Some of them have dust on them. She goes, can you bring us a book? A book. He goes, I'm bringing you food so you can eat. She goes, I know, but could you bring us a book? He said, I'll bring you as many as I could. They said he went home and he got as many copies as he could get in a language that they understood. And he brought them several crates of the book. Clive Carver, thank you so much. Clive Carver said he went back a year later where they were having a baptismal service. They were baptizing 1,000 people. By the way, they were sprinkling them. Had nothing to do with theology, but everything to do with crocodiles in the river. Can I make a suggestion? If there's crocodiles in the river, sprinkle me. I'll take a bath later or something. I don't know. You can do whatever. You know why? They had the book. I don't appreciate the book. Not like I should. I don't love it like I should. He says that I'm moaning. And, I've never suffered without having the book. From the time my mom was able to carry me, I'm sure the first place I ever went was Porter Free Will Baptist Church. My mom carried me in. That I've always been around that. I haven't suffered a lot. So I started looking into the scriptures. When did Jesus suffer? Obviously, he suffered physically on the cross. But were there other times? Ways that I could fellowship. Do you remember there was twice that Jesus cried? One we talked about earlier. One when he stood outside Lazarus' tomb. And I think he was identifying with the pain of the fellow. Somebody said, aren't you glad for this church? Who shares in your pain and shares in your joys. It's about community, isn't it? By the way, people outside would give anything to have what you have. They really would. They're searching for it. They just don't know that it's here. That's why you go and tell them. By the way, I know he cried because, I think he cried more because he looked into that tomb and he saw death. And his mind went back to the Garden of Eden when sin came into the world, and with that sin came death, and it broke his heart. Do you remember the other time that he cried? He was sitting on the hill looking over Jerusalem at sheep without a shepherd, and the scripture says he wept. Can I ask you a question? When's the last time you looked over wise and you wept because there were sheep without a shepherd? Matter of fact, when's the last time that you wept over your own sin and it broke your heart? You see, I think part of our fellowshipping in his suffering is having our hearts broken by the same thing that broke Jesus' heart. And what broke Jesus' heart was sin. He said that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of suffering, being made conformable to his death. We're like Sears batteries, aren't we? We die hard. That was incredibly cheesy. But you're laughing and almost snorted right there. I saw it. She grabbed her nose so she wouldn't snort. But don't we die hard? Some of the first missionaries to the Fiji Islands, they were getting ready to get off of the boat. And the captain of the ship said, "Do not get off. That island is filled with cannibals. If you get off this ship, you will die." Their response was, "We died before we ever got on the ship." The first missionaries in the part of Africa where we live packed all their belongings when they went in coffins because they knew they would not return. They died before they ever went. When I began this morning, I spoke in French. I do that everywhere I go. There's two reasons why. One is, I traveled around this country. I may have been here. I can't remember now. I probably was. Raising money as a missionary to go overseas. And I just want you to know that you got your money's worth. And I did learn the language. So that's part of it. The other part is this. When I was a little boy, about these guys' age back here, I had a great aunt, and if you've studied Free Will Baptist history, she was one of our very first missionaries. Her name was Bessie Ely. She was actually a missionary before Free Will Baptist had missionaries. And we started after Laura Bell Barnard went to India. They also hired Mom and Pop Willie, who went to Cuba. And my Aunt Bessie came to Cuba. She was a single lady. Came to Cuba to work with Aunt Bessie. And she would always come home and she would always sing or say something in Spanish. And I remember as a little boy saying, "I don't know what it is that Aunt Bessie does for sure. That's what I want to do. I want to tell people that never heard about Jesus and learn to speak another language." And it never left me. So I always think there's going to be some kid that hears me speak French and go, "I don't know what that's all about, but that's what I want to do." When Aunt Bessie got old enough, she came back. Well, they had to evacuate Cuba, if you know that whole story. She came to Miami and worked with Cuban refugees and eventually went out to Arizona and worked with Mexican refugees. She finally got old enough she had to retire and came back to our hometown. My mom and several of the family members said, "Aunt Bessie, won't you come out and stay out in Slocum where we can take care of you?" You know where she ended up living? She ended up living in the projects among the poorest of the poor in our town. She goes, "It would be nice to move to Slocum, but you all don't need me. They do." And she would start women's Bible studies and she had children's clubs down in the poorest section of town. That's where Aunt Bessie, she liked to go down to the 5 and dime store. They had a little cafeteria at the back like they used to, and she liked to get a hot dog. We think that's where she went. She rode a city bus. She didn't drive. She rode a city bus down there, and on her way home died. I remember I was probably a junior in high school at the time. I remember being a little angry with God. I go, "Here's somebody who gave their whole life for you. You could have done better than that. You could have done better than letting her die on a city bus." He quickly reminded me I didn't see the other end. He said, "You should have seen her when she walked through the gate." It doesn't matter where. You see, Aunt Bessie died long before she died on that city bus. She died as a little girl who said, "My life is yours. You do with it whatever you want." I want to tell one more story and I'll be done. Okay? I tell this story everywhere I go. Actually, Christy Johnson, who is one of our missionaries in Spain, she says, "Neil, I don't care what you're talking about, where you go, you have to tell that story everywhere I go." So this is for Christy, if nothing else. But it does apply. Their names were Uncle Frank and Aunt Eleanor Marshall. Uncle Frank died really just about a month ago. They had served, I talked about them just briefly in the service before, but Uncle Frank and Aunt Eleanor had worked for nearly 30 years in the city of Timbuktu. It really is a place. It's up in the country of Mali. It's a very old city in the middle of the Sahara Desert. To give you an idea of the conditions in Timbuktu, Uncle Frank, his mission sent him to be the dorm dad for 28 high school boys because he had a heart condition and it would be easier on him. Are you with me? It would be easier for him to be a dorm parent to 28 high school boys than to live where he was living. I went up to his dorm one day and I asked Uncle Frank, I said, Uncle Frank, in those 30 years, how many people in Timbuktu came to Christ? Because I knew it was 99.99% Muslim. I said, how many people came to Christ? He said, Neil, he said, during the Harmattan, when the Harmattan are winds that come across the Sahara Desert, he said, we literally would have to put our sheets up over our heads to sleep because when we'd wake up, there'd be a half inch to an inch of dust on top of our bedclothes. So in order to sleep, you couldn't keep it out. I go, okay, but you didn't answer my question. How many people came to know Jesus? He said, during the dry season when we had all those very high temperatures up in the 120s, said in order to sleep at night, Aunt Eleanor would soak sheets in barrels of water, and we would wrap ourselves in the sheet because we had no electric. And as it evaporated, it would make it cool enough so we could sleep at night. I go, okay, Uncle Frank, but you didn't answer my question. How many people came to know Jesus? He said, Neil, every day I was in Timbuktu, every day. I would go down into town, and sometimes I'd stand on the corner and preach. Sometimes I'd hand out tracts. Sometimes I'd just share my faith. And almost every day I would come home, and my pant legs would be wet where people would spit on me. I go, Uncle Frank, answer my question. How many people came to know Jesus? He said, in 30 years? I said, yeah. He said, I can count them on this hand. I said, Uncle Frank, 30 years of going through that, and you can count. Do you think it was worth that? I'll never forget it. He said, I don't know. Ask them. By the way, Uncle Frank and Aunt Eleanor died before they ever went to Timbuktu because they wanted people to know God. By the way, when the war happened and his grandchildren were at the school where my wife and I were, and he called me and I said, Uncle Frank, I've been telling this story. He said, so I just want to make sure I'm telling it right. He goes, well, it's pretty close. And Eleanor said, it's right, Neil. He won't tell you, but yes. He said, but you have to tell the rest of the story. I said, I don't know the rest of the story. He said, 2 of those have already gone home to be with the Lord. He said, 2 of them all of them became pastors. 2 of them have gone down the river and started a church. Now in Timbuktu, there's a church of 250 people. And they have gone down the Niger River to plant another mission church. I say glory to God. Can I ask a question? Do you know God? Do you really know God? One of the early missionaries in Africa said this, I want to know God as much as I can and still be alive. Interesting comment. Again, you may not agree with me. If that was verse 10, if you go down to verse 12, it said, forgetting what's behind, I press towards the mark of the prize of the high calling of God. Most people think the prize is heaven. I don't. I think it's knowing God. By the way, when we get to heaven, we will know him as he is. The prize is getting to know him. I want to know him more today than I did yesterday. But it takes time. It takes intentionality. It takes being with him. I don't know how you typically end services. I do believe this with all my heart. When the word is preached, it demands a response. Now, how you respond, I don't know. But I think anytime the word is preached, it demands a response. So I don't know how you need to respond. But you do, and he does. So will you pray with me, and then I'll turn it to you. Father, I've come to the end of my talk. But I would ask that you haven't come to the end of yours. And so I would ask that you would speak in tones that we hear very clearly. And that we'll respond in ways that give you the most glory. And I pray these things in the sweet and wonderful and powerful name of Christ. Amen.